There's a guy who has been about to change his life for the last 7 years. He's going to start the diet on Monday. He's going to apply for that job next week. He's going to fix things with his family after the holidays. He has plans, big plans, detailed plans. The only problem? He never actually starts. And here's the terrifying part: scientists now believe this isn't laziness. It isn't weakness. It's something far darker happening inside the brain. Something that, once it takes hold, becomes almost impossible to break without knowing exactly what it is. Let's talk about something most people refuse to admit about themselves. Every single person watching this right now has a version of tomorrow they're waiting for. A tomorrow where they'll finally be ready, finally be brave enough, finally have enough time. But here's what nobody tells you. The science of psychology reveals that for some people, tomorrow isn't just a habit. It's a psychological trap. And once you understand how that trap works, you'll never look at your own delays the same way again. Here's where it gets really strange. Researchers at the University of Colorado ran a study where they asked people to imagine their future self 10, 20 years from now. They scanned their brains while they did it, and what they found was absolutely shocking. When most people pictured their future self, the brain activity looked almost identical to what happens when they think about a complete stranger. Not themselves, a stranger. Which means, on a neurological level, the future version of you doesn't actually feel like you. It feels like someone else's problem. Let that sink in for a second. This is why telling someone to just think about the future almost never works. Because psychologically, they already are, and they're handing all the hard work off to a stranger they've never met. But why do some people fall into this trap deeper than others? Why do some people spend their entire lives waiting for a tomorrow that never quite arrives? The answer starts somewhere most people never look in childhood. Psychologists have identified something called future self-continuity. It's your brain's ability to feel emotionally connected to who you'll be years from now. People who feel that strong connection tend to make better decisions today. They save money, take care of their health, work toward long-term goals. But people who feel disconnected from their future self, they live almost entirely in the present moment, not in a mindful, peaceful way, but in a reckless, avoidant way. And the roots of that disconnection almost always trace back to one thing: an unpredictable childhood. Think about it. If you grew up in a home where tomorrow was uncertain, where plans constantly fell apart, where promises were broken, where stability was a stranger, your brain learned something critical. It learned that the future is not to be trusted. Why sacrifice something real today for something that might never come? The brain didn't do this to hurt you. It did it to protect you. It was a survival strategy. But now, decades later, that same strategy is quietly destroying your potential. And what makes this even more complicated is the emotion hiding underneath all of it. Here's something most self-help books skip completely. The psychology of living in tomorrow isn't just about procrastination. It's about hope. It's about the psychological comfort that comes from believing that somewhere out there, a better version of your life is waiting. And that belief, that warm, powerful feeling of things will be better soon, is actually addictive. Neuroscientists have confirmed it. Anticipation of a reward activates dopamine in the brain just as powerfully as actually receiving the reward, sometimes even more. Which means that for some people, the dream of tomorrow literally feels better than the reality of today. And that creates a dangerous loop. Let's call it the tomorrow cycle. It works like this. A person faces something uncomfortable, a difficult conversation, a challenging goal, a painful truth about their life. Instead of confronting it, they picture a future version of themselves handling it perfectly. That imagination releases a small burst of dopamine. They feel a moment of relief, even excitement. And then, nothing changes. Days pass. Weeks. The uncomfortable thing is still there. The dopamine wears off. So they imagine tomorrow again. Relief, dopamine, nothing changes. Repeat. What looks like laziness from the outside is actually a person self-medicating with their own imagination. But here's where it gets genuinely heartbreaking. People who live in tomorrow often have extraordinary visions. They dream bigger than almost anyone around them. They can see in perfect detail who they want to become. They have plans and ideas that genuinely could change their lives. But there's an invisible wall between that vision and action. And that wall isn't made of failure. It's made of fear. Specifically, a very particular kind of fear that psychologists call identity threat. Here's what that means, and why it matters more than almost anything else in this conversation. When you have been telling yourself and everyone around you that you're going to do something great tomorrow, actually starting creates a terrifying problem. Because the moment you start, you become a beginner. You're no longer the person with unlimited potential. You're someone who might fail, who might be mediocre, who might discover that the dream was bigger than the dreamer. And for someone whose identity is wrapped up in being the person with potential, that risk feels unbearable. So they stay in tomorrow, where the dream is still alive, where failure is still impossible, where they are still, technically, capable of anything. This is why simple advice like just do it or stop making excuses can actually make things worse, because it targets the behavior without ever touching the belief system underneath. And the belief system is everything. Psychologists have found that people who break free from this pattern don't do it by forcing themselves into action. They do it by fundamentally changing how they see themselves in time. They start building what researchers call future self-continuity. And the method they use is almost embarrassingly simple, but the psychology behind it is profound. They write letters to their future self. Specifically and in detail. Not "I hope I'm healthy," more like "I know you had that hard conversation I've been avoiding. I know you started the thing even when you were afraid. I know you didn't wait until you were ready, because ready never comes." Studies show that people who do this exercise consistently begin making dramatically different decisions within weeks, because suddenly the future self stops feeling like a stranger. It starts feeling like someone you actually know, someone you'd hate to let down. And that psychological shift changes everything. There's also a second strategy that research backs strongly, and it's called temptation bundling. The idea is brutally simple. You pair something you've been avoiding with something you genuinely enjoy, not as a reward after you do the hard thing, but simultaneously. Working on the thing you fear while doing something that brings real pleasure. The brain starts to associate the avoided task with positive emotion. The wall doesn't disappear overnight, but it gets shorter and shorter until one day you realize you've crossed it without even noticing. But there's a deeper truth underneath all of this that almost nobody talks about. The people who spend their lives living in tomorrow are not weak. They are not broken. They are, in many ways, some of the most imaginative, emotionally complex, deeply feeling people you will ever meet. They have vivid inner worlds. They feel things intensely. They genuinely want to be better. The tragedy isn't that they dream. The tragedy is that they've never been taught that action doesn't require certainty, that starting doesn't require readiness, that the version of you who has it all together is built, one imperfect day at a time, from the version of you who started anyway. Here's the most important thing you can take from this video. Tomorrow is not a destination. It is a direction. And the only way to ever actually get there is by taking one real, imperfect, uncomfortable step today. Not because you're ready, not because you're certain, but because the stranger in your brain, the one scientists identified as your future self, is waiting. And unlike the fantasy version of tomorrow, that person can only be built in the one place that's real, right here, right now.